Diffusion, the international science radio show.
We have a bouncer on the doors of perception.
The good, the bad, the ugly.
It gets pretty exciting.
The myths, the truths.
Toxicology.
Astroseismology.
Magnetism. The dark side.
Genetically engineered potatoes.
Planetoid.
Planetoid.
I love that word.
Hello and welcome to Diffusion. Sit back and relax while we polymerize weird and wonderful science to enhance your brain. I'm Ian Woolf. On this edition, Dr. Markus Mullner talks about the world of long-chain molecules in the age of polymers. The Polymer Age. Markus Mullner is a senior lecturer in the School of Chemistry at the University of Sydney. He's lived in Australia for the last 10 years, driving his group's research into the architecture of polymers and the use of polymers in medicine and hybrid materials. Markus will be speaking at the Frontiers of Science Forum on March 12, 2021 at the Concord Golf Club about how modern polymer chemistry advances technology. I spoke with Markus by Zoom and began by asking him what exactly is a polymer.
Your audience will be quite familiar with what a molecule in general is, so thinking of caffeine or pharmaceutical drugs, these are usually small molecules. Polymers are molecules as well, however, they are macromolecules, so they are large molecules. They have a much higher molecular weight. If you think of a polymer, you could imagine it as a pearl necklace structure. So you have small subunits or small molecules, and that are then all connected together to form a long chain of all those pearls, and that would be a polymer chain. And you could think of, for example, changing the polymer chain as well. So changing the amount of beads you have on it. So you change the length of it or change the color, so to speak, so the chemical identity, and so that you can play with polymer properties.
And we use polymers all over the place, everywhere in modern life.
Yeah, in fact, we live in the polymer age. So when you go through the ages, Bronze Age, Stone Age, it's usually defined by a material class that has helped humanity go to the next step. And currently we live in the polymer age. Anything you touch, anything you see would have to do with some way or another with a polymer or a biopolymer. So yeah, they're omnipresent.
And are we coming up on a big anniversary for polymers?
So polymers have been around for obviously a long time, and they have been studied knowingly and unknowingly. So they're dating back to people using milk stone, for example, in 150 years ago, not knowing that they were working with a polymer, for example, but they used milk to generate a material that is essentially a biopolymer. So they've been around for a long time, but we came up to an anniversary last year, 2020, that marked the 100th anniversary of a seminal work by Professor Staudinger, who basically coined the term macromolecule. He faced quite a bit of opposition as well back in the day, because a lot of small molecule chemists didn't believe that macromolecules exist. So they thought he's just a sloppy chemist and he doesn't purify his materials. But later on, he obviously won the Nobel Prize for his discovery of macromolecules and its importance in proteins and biomacromolecules. So there was a big milestone reached last year, 100 years of macromolecules.
And you're looking at designing polymers for exactly the properties you want them to have.
Yeah, so looking at polymer, I described it earlier as simply a long chain molecule, but of course you can change the properties of that molecule to fit it a certain purpose. When you're looking at commodity polymers, of course you can have a plastic bag that is very flexible, but you can have something that is rather hard and ductile, like the light switch. So these are all plastics or polymers. Things that we look at in research is we're looking at things at a smaller scale. So we have tools where we can change the properties of the polymer by synthesizing polymers in a very defined length, but also in a defined architecture. So for example, if you start to branch your polymer versus just having a linear polymer, then you can switch on new properties that are not existing in the linear chain. So a linear chain, for example, in solution wants to coil. Whereas if you attach side chains to it, so you have a branched architecture, something I'm working on, polymers, they call it polymer brushes, or they look like bottle brush plants. They resemble the structure of bottle brushes. Then if you have a crowding of chains, they cannot coil anymore. So through that, you have distinctly different properties, particularly thinking of chains cannot entangle anymore. They have a lower friction.
So, for example, we might have, I believe, all plastics are polymers, but not all plastics behave the way we would like them to behave.
That is correct. So all plastics are predominantly polymers, I would say. There are a lot of composite materials out there. Plastics actually comes from Greek, from plastikos, so being formable or shapeable. So that general description obviously would fit also composite materials. And we often, in commodity materials, add things that are fillers, so you have a better optical properties or you have better barrier properties. So the reason why we are interested in changing, for example, the architecture of a polymer is because through that we're switching on new properties, as I mentioned, and we are keen to use polymers in the context of nanomedicine. So nanomedicine is essentially the use of nanotechnology to advance medicine. And we all know, for example, chemotherapy can be very harsh on the body, and this has to do with small molecule drugs having side effects, or they don't reach the desired tissue in time, or they accumulate in healthy cells where they technically shouldn't go. And nanomedicine offers a concept by which it encapsulates the cytotoxic drug and then protects it from causing harmful side effects, but also guiding its way to the area of interest, such as diseased tissue or tumorous tissue. And most of the carriers that are studied sort of in the last 2 decades, 3 decades, are materials that resemble sphere, so that the carrier that carries the drug is usually a spherical object. And this is mainly associated with its ease of synthesis. But if we want to understand, or if we want to improve that nanomedicine concept, we need to also be able to understand how, for example, a carrier shape, carrier stiffness, carrier surface chemistry affects its performance. And we were just a bit short in having synthetic approaches to tailor or to custom make such carriers. So one way we can do this is by the technology that we use, which is the polymer brush technology, where we can make spherical objects, but at the same time we can make materials that are rod-like, cylinder or filamentously shaped. They can be hard, they can be soft, they can be compartmentalized. We have a distinct core and a distinct shell. And by building up this library, we can then, within one system, develop a structure-function-property relationship that allows us to better predict how this material will actually perform in a nanomedicine context. So, for example, we could show that if you compare a sphere and the rod actually can outperform the sphere. The rod can accumulate better in tumor tissue and even can penetrate deeper compared to the sphere. So, of course, this then opens up other avenues to explore this further in developing nanomedicine platforms around rod-shaped materials.
So you've got a library of different shapes that have different properties and different effects when they go into a polymer, and you can assemble a new polymer out of the different modules. Is that what you're saying?
So the brush platform allows you to make polymers of different shapes and of different, and endow them with different properties. And then this platform we use in various areas, one being nanomedicine, to better understand how carrier dimensions or design parameters affect their performance in the context of nanomedicine. So they're all made from polymers. It's more, the delicacy here is really how to stitch the polymers together. So if you have a brushed architecture, you would need a polymer main chain that has attached various chains onto this main chain. So the chemistry becomes important. And how do you achieve this precise attachment of polymer chains onto a long backbone? And this is something rather tricky, and I think I'm currently the only researcher in Australia focusing on brush technology.
Very interesting. So is nanomedicine the main application that you're looking at?
It certainly, over the last few years, this has been our main focus and sort of our main avenue of using our research funding. But in recent years, we have discovered other ways where our peculiar architecture can be of interest. So one thing that we're currently working on extensively is looking at osteoarthritis, so the degeneration of cartilage. We are living in an aging population, so this is something that will affect all of us towards the end of our life. I think 1 in 10 of all Australians already experiences osteoarthritis. So there are two ways really of how one can think of targeting this. So one would be to replace damaged tissues with a synthetic material, or like when you have a hip joint replacement, this is usually you replacing it with a foreign object that does the same job. or you can use concepts of tissue engineering, where you actually embed a tissue that contains also cartilage or cells that are found in cartilage. And then by changing or by adjusting the properties of the gel, you motivate those gels to actually reproduce or regenerate healthy cartilage tissue. And when you look at nature's cartilage, it's basically two main components that act together that give the function of cartilage. The collagen network, but more importantly, it contains proteoglycan aggregates. And those proteoglycan aggregates actually look like a bottle brush. So since we're working closely with, or since I have focused in the last sort of decade on really refining the way we can make and then also utilize branched polymer architectures, we are now working on using our molecular brushes as biomimetic materials, so mimicking the structure and then hopefully also the properties of proteoglycans, so we can make new gels that behave similar to cartilage that then allow for regeneration of healthy cartilage tissue.
Amazing. So is arthritis another illness where you need to regenerate cartilage?
Osteoarthritis is the condition, basically one form of arthritis, but essentially the degeneration of cartilage tissue.
You're listening to Ian Woolf on Diffusion Science Radio. Send emails to science@diffusionradio.com. We're brought to you across Australia on the Community Radio Network and podcast over the internet on www.diffusionradio.com. Would you like to tell me a little bit about the history of polymers?
Yeah, so the history of polymer, I think it dates back to actually quite a while. I think there's early writings from 1530 or so where I think a Swiss monk had an exchange and telling his colleagues, or handing over a recipe, basically telling him, if you follow my steps precisely, you generate a material that you can shape in all kinds of forms, or they can form into all kinds of shapes. And what they were actually talking about is using biopolymers, in their case, for example, milk. And if you heat it up, you actually cross-link your proteins and you get something that's called gallolith, so it's milk stone. So if you, for example, visit Vienna in Austria, you might still see on old buildings actually some doorbells that are made from that material. So it's a very old material. Centuries ago, people did not know that they were working on polymers or making plastics, but certainly people were already using it. Another example is, for example, pectin that you extract from fruits that is used to gel a marmalade. That is also a long-chain polysaccharide polymer that people used very frequently in early days, but did not really know that they were using polymers. I think polymers really came to the forefront, particularly during the world wars. And there were a lot of embargoes around the world, restrictions to get to natural materials, natural resources. Not every country had access to cotton. So a lot of the synthetic polymers or the commodity polymers that we use nowadays were actually invented and discovered around that time, purely out of necessity to replace natural resources. So the materials that we fast forward 100 years, I mentioned before, we just had the 100-year anniversary of Staudinger, so declaring that macromolecules exist. The commodity polymers actually have not really changed much. We're still using a lot of the polyolefins in our daily life. But what has changed over the last 100 years is really the way we understand the material and the way we can use it nowadays. To stick with polyethylene as an example, polyethylene is used in, for example, single-use plastic bags. And everybody will be familiar with those and their properties. If you buy a water tank, for example, for rainwater, might be made from the same material. It's just that the branching has changed or the molecular weight has changed. In fact, you can use the same material to make a very long chain to make bulletproof vests. And I think that's very impressive. It's the same material, it's just carbon and hydrogen, but just by understanding and being able to tune its molecular weight, its length, its branching, we can make a distinctly different material class.
It's an amazing difference.
Yeah. No, it's such a simple polymer, but obviously it's made from finite resources. So I think one big push in the future will be, of course, really work on not just recycling, i.e. the collection of plastic or polymer waste and then repurposing it, but I think there's a big push in the world as well to come up with new synthesis methods that allow us to go more into a circular economy or circular life cycle of polymers. So rather than repurposing them, we would like to basically break them down into their original building blocks into their monomers and repolymerize them to form pristine material again with pristine properties. So I think going forward, sustainability and everything that it encompasses will be a very big field, not just in polymer science, but in chemistry and chemical manufacturing in general. Even though we are mainly looking at the use of polymer architectures, we're also interested in making synthesis of polymers easier and maybe also a little bit more sustainable. And something that is emerging in contemporary polymer science currently is the introduction or basically the rediscovery of light chemistry, so using light to drive reactions. This is a very old chemistry really, but it's basically being repurposed for new concepts. So a lot of the polymers that would traditionally be made, they are made in sort of batch reactors and usually with heat to heat up the reaction media and facilitate some form of reaction. But sort of in the last decade or so, scientists have rediscovered the way of using light as the trigger to actually drive that polymerization. And through that, it was discovered that we have actually formidable control, not only over the polymerization, so we can make even better materials, but also we're taking heat out of the equation. So if you are able to run a material synthesis via light, you have firstly spatial control, so it will only happen where the light hits. You have temporal control, switch off the light, no reaction, switch on the light, you have the reaction. But if you're looking at it from an energy profile, you're also taking away the heat that was necessary. So if you want to make this into a bigger process down the track, you also need less energy to run that reaction. And something that we developed in that area was actually the use of a waste product from the mining industry, or a side product, the bismuth oxide. It's a semiconductor material that absorbs also visible light, and we could show that we could use that semiconductor as a photoredox catalyst to drive polymerizations simply by shining light from a generic household lamp onto it. We're driving then a photoredox process that allows you to grow polymers just in water, for example. So this is another process where we're making materials in a more environmentally friendly way, but also our catalyst is actually a heterogeneous catalyst, so that means it's actually easily recovered from the solution, and you can reuse it. So for recycling, that's also another avenue.
Very interesting. The only thing I didn't ask you what people would have to study to work with polymers, but is the answer just chemistry?
It kind of depends where you are on the globe. I mean, I think you said you can listen to your podcast around the world. So
yes.
I think, yes, chemistry is the gateway, I would say, because a lot of it is chemistry. But I think the future, again, in polymer science, polymer science is a truly interdisciplinary research frontier. So you not only need chemistry, I think in the future, you need to understand a bit about chemical engineering, particularly the things that I talked about, light-driven reactions, sustainability. A lot of flow chemistry will nowadays come into the picture. There's a lot of 3D printing going on with polymers. So not just knowing the chemistry won't be enough, I think. So you need to understand a bit more about engineering. And with data science or computer science, big data, nowadays, I think there's lots of software development, machine learning, robots that can make chemical syntheses as well, sometimes better than the humans. So I think chemistry, as a chemist and having done my PhD in chemistry, yes, I would say chemistry is still sort of the central science in that. But I think by studying chemical engineering or computer science or other things, you're not locking yourself in to not make sort of the move into polymer science, mainly because it's very, very interdisciplinary. I think sort of the main things, I mean, we are interested in architectures. We're the only ones in Australia really having that expertise. So we want to make use of that. The technology that we have developed, I told you about the two examples, the cartridge one and the Nanomedicine one. I'm a passionate polymer chemist or polymer scientist, and I'm interested obviously in the history of polymers. I do lectures here as well at the university, and I try to contextualize as well inventions or everyday materials that we use with how have we come to this place, and also where do we need to go now. So in my lectures here at the university, it's not just a historical excursion and talking about the chemistry, so to speak. It's really also looking forward or looking ahead on what are the challenges that our future students need to help contribute so we can overcome it. After all, we're producing the next generation of scientists, and they will need to help us really tackle sustainability and making the next leap, basically. I don't know what's past the polymer age, but there will be another age. I'm happy to talk about the future. I mean, this is obviously a personal spin. I'm part of an international advisory board for a major polymer journal, and together with all the other advisory board members, we've written an essay last year to commemorate the 100 years anniversary of polymers. But we basically look ahead and what's meant to be going on in the next 100 years of polymer science. And key areas that we have identified is definitely sustainability. So as I touched on before, polymers, microplastics, all these things are constantly in the news. We are now aware of that. There's a lot of legislation being changed to basically overcome some of the difficulties. But of course, we need to rethink a little bit our materials of the future, particularly also since we're working with finite resources. And that brings me then to the next step. So we need to come up with new ways of making polymers, or with new ways of achieving similar properties that we currently have with our commodity polymers. One of the big hurdles always is that if we want to integrate biomaterials, they are very different to, for example, a polyethylene that I was talking about. A polyolefin is carbon and hydrogen. If you look at a biopolymer, and this is why biopolymers are so fantastic in what they are doing, but they often have other heteroatoms. They have oxygen, they have nitrogen, and that gives them completely different properties. So if we want to make a material that behaves like polyethylene, but is not made from polyethylene, these are challenges, and these are challenges for the future, to come up with either new materials or find new ways of making a material that behaves similarly. And some of your radio program also frequently features space or talks about space. Obviously, humans want to go to Mars. This is a journey that is very long. We need to have lightweight materials. The prime example for a lightweight material are polymers again. So how can we make the next generation of polymers that last, to be in the extreme situations that they would have to be in high vacuum, very cold temperatures, long journey, UV exposure. So these are things, no doubt, NASA and other researchers are thinking about it, but this is also some part of where do we see us as humans. If we want to live at a different planet, we need to have materials also that are able to facilitate that. And polymers, I think, will play a big role in that as well.
Well, thank you, Markus, very much.
Thank you very much, Ian, for having a chat to me.
That was Dr. Markus Mullner from the University of Sydney talking about the age of polymers. Dr. Mullner will be speaking at the Frontiers of Science Forum on the 12th of March 2021 at the Concord Golf Club.
In the laboratories of Your Name Here, there is a modest sign. And here, dedicated scientists face the challenge. Years of heartbreaking failures and setbacks only stiffen their resolve to conquer the problem. And one day, a strange and historic accident.
Uh-oh. Well, you did it again.
Gee, what a mess.
Oh, well.
Wait a minute. Maybe... Listen.
By gad, do you suppose this freak accident...
Of course. That's it. That's the answer. We've done it. After all these years, we've invented it.
How about that?
And with those historic words, the search was over. From the laboratories of
Your Name Here
had come the key to the secret that had baffled man through the ages. No longer a dream, but a reality was
Your Product Here.
And that's all from us this week on Diffusion. Are you a scientist, artist, biohacker or maker who'd like to be interviewed about your work? Would your company like to sponsor Diffusion? Send your contributions, opinions, helpful suggestions and donations to science@diffusionradio.com. That's science@diffusionradio.com. Please rate the show on iTunes. Tell your friends. Follow me on Twitter @Ian Woolf. The news music was Rhinos Theme by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com. I produce Diffusion, which is broadcast around Australia to 28 stations on the Community Radio Network, including Radio Blue Mountains 89.1 FM in New South Wales, 8CCC in Alice Springs and Tennant Creek, 2NVR in Nambucca Valley, 3MBR in the Marlborough districts of Victoria and South Australia, City Park Radio 7LTN in Launceston, Tasmania, and 2XXFM in Canberra. Diffusion is narrowcast on Indigo FM 88 in northeast Victoria. Diffusion is syndicated globally on the National Science Foundation's Science 360 internet radio station and also on astronomy.fm. Subscribe to the podcast on the Diffusion website, www.diffusionradio.com. That's www.diffusionradio.com. Check the website for links, photos and videos about this week's show. If you enjoyed the show, you can explore more than 1,000 previous episodes archived on diffusionradio.com, where the shows are labelled by keywords so you can focus in on the stories you want to hear. Make a donation through paypal.me/Ian Woolf. Or join my patrons at patreon.com/diffusionradio. You can now buy a Diffusion Radio t-shirt from diffusionradio.com/support. I'm Ian Woolf. Join us inside your audio device of choice for more science wondering next week on Diffusion Science Radio.
Science is fun. It helps you to learn, to know, and to appreciate. When you study science, you may go on field trips. You discover the marvelous interrelationships between all living things. You learn to read the history of the Earth as it is written in rocks and fossils. You find out what makes things tick, everything from a molecule to a living organism. In the study of science is found the most useful and satisfying knowledge of man. Knowledge of his physical world, its past, its present, and its future. And in your moments of relaxation, now and in the years to come, you will find the study of science leading you into fascinating pursuits. Photography, collecting. Why study science? Study science because you will find in the study of science a richer, more rewarding life.